The protection of migratory birds is a vitally important issue, and the sad fact is that a lot of migratory bird species are declining. We've lost about 3 billion birds in North America in the last few decades. So this is an issue that requires some sort of solution. The question is, what is that solution?
You heard it right. 29% of birds are estimated to have died, and that's just over the past 30 years. But why? Why have bird populations plummeted? A lot of it has to do with people and the impact their decisions have on the environment. Determined to address the man-made causes, the United States and Great Britain combined forces. Britain signed the Migratory Bird Treaty, and the United States created the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was enacted in 1918 in response to rapidly dwindling bird populations due to a combination of changing environmental factors, overhunting, and harmful and neglectful practices. It prohibits the killing, capturing, selling, trading, and transport of protected migratory bird species without express permission.
So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is actually one of the earliest federal wildlife protection statutes. It actually implements a treaty between the United States and Great Britain, at that time acting on behalf of Canada.
The government of Canada and the United States negotiated a treaty to try to protect these migratory species, and the focus of this statute, which was enacted to implement the treaty, was to limit the way people collect or hunt migratory birds. And you can understand why a federal statute might target that problem. Any individual state on its own doesn't have the right incentives. So if you have a bird that's migrating from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Canada every single year and back, any one state that doesn't properly protect the species could cause significant declines.
Some really very tragic tales came to Congress's attention. One notable one, particularly tragic one, involved the passenger pigeon, which people may have heard about. At a time during the mid-1800s, passenger pigeons were so numerous that there would be flocks that would literally blot out the sun. Millions of birds would fly overhead. So the last passenger pigeon was hunted in the wild in the year 1900. And the last passenger pigeon that existed at all, a pigeon named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in the year 1914. And after that, there were no passenger pigeons anymore. And that was the kind of story that led Congress to adopt the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
On one hand, the act has been credited with preventing the extinction of numerous species, like the sandhill crane, snowy egret, and wood duck. But underneath the surface of that success lies an ever-changing approach to enforcement, creating a partisan pendulum swinging back and forth between administrations. Conservationists disagree about the best way to encourage compliance. Some point to positive motivations or incentives, while others promote penalties as the best approach.
The overall effect of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has been mixed. If you're going to be hunting migratory birds, if you're going to be collecting feathers or other artifacts, you're going to be going through the system and being regulated. The problem is that that's no longer the major threat to migratory birds. And instead of enacting a new statute to address those threats, federal regulators and federal prosecutors have tried to morph this statute into something that it was never intended to be, and that's actually what's caused a lot of the problems.
Changes in the way the treaty is implemented have created confusion among business owners and policymakers alike. Further complicating the situation is the evolving nature of the problem. In other words, the threats bird populations faced 100 years ago simply aren't the same as they are today, so enforcement must adapt. But how?
A new report shows more than 400 species, a third of North America's migratory birds, are facing extinction.
It's not a great time to be a bird, thanks to things like habitat loss, climate change, and just
the center has identified multiple cases of an unknown illness in songbird species across Central Ohio.
Migrating birds are colliding into tall buildings and dying in huge numbers.
Hitting buildings, windows, and cars, being attacked by cats or dogs, poisoned by pesticides.
Wind turbines kill 234,000 birds a year. That sounds...
Most of the enforcement of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is targeted at industry, especially oil and natural gas, the development of which can result in damage to migratory birds, as well as renewable energy. So wind turbines, solar arrays do cause a lot of bird deaths. And so you see people on different sides of the political spectrum choosing which to focus on.
What do you do about that? How does the statute apply to those kinds of activities? And that is really what the major controversy has been in the last number of years, and where we've had shifting approaches to that issue depending upon which administration happened to be in power and how expansively or how restrictively they wanted to read the statute.
The MBTA makes it a crime for any person to take a migratory bird. Take is defined broadly to include pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect migratory birds, or to attempt such activities. Migratory birds protected by the Act include approximately 90% of all birds occurring in North America. There has been uncertainty surrounding the scope of the MBTA's take prohibition for decades, coming to a head in the 1970s. While the original purpose of the MBTA was to regulate overhunting of migratory birds, primarily by commercial enterprises, in the 1970s the interpretation broadened to permit prosecuting the incidental taking of protected birds. Since that time, persons engaging in an activity likely to result in a take, however unintentional and otherwise lawful, have faced the risk of prosecution.
In the waning days of the Obama administration, the Solicitor of the Interior put out an interpretation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that ratified this notion that incidental take, incidental killing, was covered by the Act, at least under certain circumstances. And about the same time, the Obama administration indicated an intention through, I think, a document called the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking to start developing a more systematic regulatory approach by which industry could get certainty as to how it would comply with the Act, be insulated from any potential enforcement action, but at the same time committing to certain basic measures to better conserve migratory birds.
Within a matter of, I think, a month, the Trump administration came in and enacted a new regulation or new interpretation getting rid of that and saying that no, the terms in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act are consistent with the original purpose about activities directed at a migratory bird, where the intention is to kill a migratory bird or to capture a migratory bird. That if a bird death just accidentally happens, that's not a crime under federal law. Depending on the administration, the focus might be on renewable energy, which kills a lot of birds. Or if the politics shift, suddenly the enforcement is all towards traditional energy and oil and gas, but we ignore the renewable energy causes of death. And so ultimately what you're seeing is that enforcement is political.
When you get to what I think we're really focusing on, because that's the current controversy, which is this incidental take type of issue. The one way to look at that is we have not had in place in this country the same kind of real formal system for regulating those activities. Rather, those activities have been addressed through the statute, more through kind of an informal system over the years. The Fish and Wildlife Service trying to work with various industries to establish common sense measures for limiting the impacts of certain industrial activities on bird populations.
Partisanship aside, the biggest point of debate between experts is whether the policies should focus on providing incentives or penalizing offenses. Anti-enforcement experts point to incentives as an effective, utilitarian alternative to more heavy-handed penalties, which their opponents defend as necessary for the protection of wildlife.
From my vantage point, certainly how you set up a system like that, certainly how you address impacts, whatever system you have, should not be based upon collateral policy objectives. In other words, it should not be based upon your desire to motivate or encourage one industry as opposed to another one for reasons that have nothing to do with migratory birds. It should be based upon impacts on migratory birds. An industry level impact, impacts in a particular part of the country, that should be like the critical but narrow focus. How do we actually address impacts on migratory birds? And that it provides an assurance to all industries that we're not bringing other collateral types of policy objectives into play when we're trying to basically stem this ongoing decline of migratory bird populations.
The Biden administration has suggested it might adopt a permitting regime for incidental impacts to migratory birds. None of the details are out. There's nothing specific. It's just this idea out there in the ether. And it would be a significant improvement compared to a broad criminal interpretation without a permitting regime. Because at least this way, there would be things you could do to ensure that you wouldn't become a criminal, that you wouldn't face criminal prosecution. But as with many things, the devil's in the details. Like, if the permitting regime is set up correctly and creates the right incentives so that people are actively engaged in bird conservation, great. But there's also a risk that it's not going to work out that way, and instead it'll be used as a way to pick winners and losers based on the politics of individual industries.
I think it would actually move things in the right direction. Obviously, there's always a trade-off between how specific and how rigorous it is, and on the other hand, providing an incentive for industry to actually participate. But I think a system that actually provides some kind of a permitting regime, authorization regime, can be an effective system. I think the critical thing to understand is that the kind of system that I'm promoting and I think others in the conservation community are promoting right now really is a approach designed to incentivize by having, once again, a fairly comprehensive but usable approach to getting authorization under a statute that otherwise broadly prohibits unauthorized incidental take. So unless the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is going to be nullified in some fashion, which I don't think is likely to happen through congressional action or otherwise, we do have this sort of background situation where killing migratory birds renders those who do that subject to potential liability.
What doesn't tend to work is command and control regulation, the threat of criminal penalties for doing something that could never reasonably be enforced. There are just not enough federal investigators and prosecutors to find every single homeowner who's changing their land in a way that is somewhat detrimental to migratory birds. The only way to tackle that problem is to create the right incentives. You can't police your way out of it. And so where the effort needs to happen is what sort of incentives can we put in place so that everyone who has land that could be habitat for migratory birds have an incentive to do that, where the presence of a bird is a benefit to them rather than a risk.
I think if you have a system which doesn't establish any kind of regulatory floor, then again, what you do is create a very perverse incentive system for those who would want to do the right thing to basically not do it because they see other actors in the same industry getting away with adopting no protections whatsoever. So I understand the desire to work with a voluntary approach, but I think what we can do here is build on the voluntary approaches that, when done the right way, have been effective. And if you don't do that, then I think what you wind up doing is penalizing those members of industries that actually want to do the right things by birds. And I think that's actually a bad incentive system to establish.
With the pendulum swinging back and forth, experts are left wondering about the impact of future administrations on enforcement of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. More importantly, will bird populations rebound, or will a decimation continue?
Ultimately, this is a question that's going to have to be resolved by the courts. In the last few years, we've seen different administrations try to resolve it administratively and it just bounces back and forth. That's predictable. That's what happens for regulation all the time. Generally, a new administration comes in, it spends most of its time undoing what the last administration did, just to itself be undone in the next administration. Ultimately, all this back and forth between administrations, while interesting and impactful in that people are trying to find a way not to be prosecuted, will in the long run not affect the interpretation. Because at some point, the courts are going to have to say what this law means, and that will be the end of the debate.
To me, the best case scenario is, given what the Biden administration has embarked on, given the law as it's evolved, the best case scenario would be one in which we get, again, actors of good faith in industry, in the conservation community, within the government, to basically come to some level of understanding. And that doesn't mean everybody's going to be perfectly happy, with the outcome. I'm a firm believer of having worked on these kinds of issues for many years, that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And compromise is essential if you're going to accomplish anything useful from a conservation standpoint.